Hi, we're going to be talking about the book of Ruth. We're going to be going over a little historical background for Ruth, and then I'm going to give you a big picture overview of it. So for this first clip, we're going to be talking about the background for the book of Ruth. You guys have just finished the book of Judges, and in the Judges, the repeated theme, the repeated idea was that every man did what was right in his own eyes. And you saw that through the book of Judges, they were constantly sinning, crying out to God. God would raise up a judge, they would repent, then they'd follow the Lord, then they'd start sinning, da-da-da. So it's called the cycle of sin in the book of Judges. In the Hebrew text, the book of Ruth is connected tightly with the book of Judges, and she is seen as the light in the midst of the darkness. We don't have an actual date for the book of Ruth, but sometime near the end of the time of the Judges, because it shows that David is her grandson. The book of Ruth is generally thought to be written as a justification for the Davidic kingdom. Generally, people think that Samuel was the one who wrote the book of Ruth, taking from it the story of how that all came about. Also, an interesting thing to note in the book of Ruth is that Ruth is a Moabitess. She is a Gentile. And out of a Gentile woman comes the line of David. That's a very interesting thing, because if we remember back with what God told Abraham and Sarah, that their children would be a blessing to the nations. That was the beginning of the plan of salvation for not only the Jewish people, but for all the nations. And we see through Caleb marrying Rahab that she was a Gentile, and out of her became Boaz, and out of Boaz came David. And we see that all throughout God's plan, Gentiles are included. They're never excluded. Another interesting thing is that Ruth was a Moabitess, and if we remember in Numbers 24, Balaam is hired by Balak to prophesy against the people of Israel. And Balak was the king of the Moabites. And as Balaam, every time he tried to bring a curse upon Israel, God kept giving him the word of blessing. And he said, out of Israel, out of Judah, will rise a scepter, and it will rule over the Moabites. So again, it's an interesting thing that David's grandmother is a Moabitess, and out of David, through that line, comes Jesus, the Son of God. So that's just a little bit of interesting historical background. What's going on in Israel at this time? Well, there's a famine. And we know from Deuteronomy 28 that when the people didn't follow the Lord, generally what was brought upon them was the curse of famine. So sometime in the time of the Judges, there was a famine going on that meant the people were not serving God, and they had to leave the country. So here we have a Jewish man and his sons and his wife, and they go into the land of Moab. And the sons grow up, and they marry two Moabite women, and then the husband and the sons die. So here's Naomi. She's left alone. In the Moabite culture, a widow was essentially left to starve. She had to take care of herself. There was nothing set up to take care of widows and orphans in the Moabite culture. So she's decided she would go back to her homeland, back to where she has relatives, back to the hometown of her husband, Bethlehem. That's where he was from. Interesting, right? Because we remember that there's a guy named Jesus who was born in Bethlehem. And Bethlehem literally means house of bread. So she goes back, and as they're getting ready to cross out of Moab and into the land of Israel, she encourages her daughter-in-laws to go back to their families. Some of it probably was, yes, because she cared about them and she wanted them to succeed. But also, if they went with her, she'd have to take care of them also. So it was like an added burden. And Orpah, she went back to her family. But Ruth said no. She made a huge stand, and she said, no, where you will go, I will go. And where you die, I will die. And your God will be my God, and your people, my people. And so she stuck with Naomi. And as we see in the text, she becomes a better daughter to Naomi than her sons ever could have been. Ruth took care of Naomi. She provided heir for the family, and again was part of the line of David, which became the line of Judah, which became the family that Jesus was born into through Mary and Joseph. So that's about it for the historical background. A couple of other things to keep in mind is if you have access to the internet, to look up the times for the calendar of the barley harvest and what time of year that was. There's some really good handouts on Google, and you can look those up, and it really will help you out to understand what's going on at that time with the harvest season. Also, the Levirate covenant, with Boaz being a relative of Naomi. He was obliged to help carry on the name of the man who died. And you find that in Deuteronomy 24 and 25. Those show up. And even how a Levirate contract is signed by handing over a shoe. Why a shoe? We don't know. They just did that. That was the thing they did. But that's laid out in Deuteronomy. So we see that it follows the law. It follows what God had set in place for those that were left without an heir, for those that had husbands or sons who had died and weren't able to leave an heir, and also for the care of widows. She went out to harvest because in Exodus as well as Deuteronomy and Leviticus, they were told that they weren't to harvest the very edges of the field. They're only supposed to go through the middle and get the choice and leave the edges for the widows and the orphans. So we see God's care for those who were left without someone to care for them physically. That they could go and they could harvest the corners. They could go and they could be part of the community. And they weren't left destitute, which was, again, a sharp contrast to what was going on in Moab at that time. In the next segment, we're going to give the big picture of what goes on in the